Good afternoon. My name's Nick Napier and I'm speaking for Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Welcome to one of our occasional Sunday afternoon live interviews. I'm very happy this week to be able to interview Richard Haley, who is one of the founder members and a leading member still in Scotland Against Criminalising Communities. Richard will tell you what the main focus of that campaign is, but it's timely to have him. They have a conference coming up next Saturday. So two conferences simultaneously in Glasgow and London, but SACC is responsible for the Glasgow one. Richard, welcome.
Good afternoon, Mick. Good to talk to you.
Yes. Now, maybe you could tell the viewers why you're having this conference, what the main aim is, and why they might benefit from turning up. Richard, over to you.
Okay, Mick. It's a slightly long story, which I'll try to make not too long. As a campaign, we, SACC, are mainly a campaign for civil liberties in the context of the war on terror and against the so-called war on terror, the series of wars that began with the attacks on Afghanistan and Iraq. So on the face of it, we're a civil liberties campaign. We're not a campaign about racism. However, these are civil liberties issues where racism is absolutely central. And so from the early days of our campaign, that's been one of our focuses. Now, I think about 5-6 years ago now, the Islamic Human Rights Commission, who are based in London, contacted us to ask if we would cooperate with them on a Islamophobia conference, the idea being that there would be a series of simultaneous conferences around Europe. And that day, in the first year in which we participated, there was a conference in London, no conference in Scotland, and a series of conferences around Europe, Madrid, Paris, and so on. Subsequently, we've had a separate conference in up in Scotland, sometimes a week different date, sometimes the same date. Up until now, it's always been in Edinburgh. So this is the first time we've had our conference in Glasgow, and hopefully that will open it up to a bigger and wider conference. And I think it's extremely pertinent this year for a lot of reasons. We've seen racism of all forms, but perhaps particularly Islamophobia, play a part in the whole sequence of events that's brought us to this election.
Okay, well, look, you're focusing quite rightly on Islamophobia. The BBC seems to be focusing much more on alleged anti-Semitism. Let's talk about the Tory party. They may win, God forbid, they may win the election on Thursday. Johnson promised a Tory party investigation into Islamophobia following some quite horrific and disgusting revelations by some of their candidates. He seems to have rowed back from that. Could you comment on that, Richard? How deep is the Tory party's commitment, or chunks of it, to actively promoting Islamophobia, and why do you think they've rowed back from that commitment? Yeah.
Well, it's slightly complicated to unravel all of this because it's an unraveling of bad and worse. The Tory party are the party of the British establishment, and therefore they carry with them the inbuilt racism and Islamophobia that's shaped British imperialism and the British state through its history. They've picked up the specific pushes towards Islamophobia that were spearheaded by Tony Blair's Labour government, and now find themselves opposed by a different version of the Labour Party led by Jeremy Corbyn, who was a prominent member of the Stop the War coalition and took an exactly opposite position. So, of course, the Tory party are Islamophobic. Why has he rowed back from an investigation into party Islamophobia? Well, that's a bit tricky because it's...
Maybe he didn't like what he would find.
I'm sure he didn't like what he would find, but it's usual enough to find the establishment conducting very superficial fake inquiries on these matters, and they can generally control them and keep them within acceptable bounds, and going through them is one of the things that has to be done to maintain the pretense that these institutions aren't in fact Islamophobic. Because the last few decades have seen.
So you don't think the Tory party is Islamophobes, and they were pretty disgusting. You don't think it's a few rotten apples, do you? You think the whole barrel has got a commitment from empire dominating tens and hundreds of millions of Muslims for decades. You reckon there's a general saturation of Islamophobic ideas into the elite?
Yes, I'm sure it is. There's some exceptions, and one obvious exception is Saeed Awasi, and why she joined the Tory party in the first place is a mystery that you might discuss with her at some time. But despite a lot of political differences with her, she in fact talks a great deal of sense about Islamophobia, and I know she's expressed herself as being deeply disappointed in the Tory party's conduct. So from her perspective, it seems that she did hope that some correction would be possible, that people like her, Muslims who may for some other reason have an inclination towards the Tory party, would be given sufficient support for them to be able to see their way to participating in that party, and that simply hasn't happened. I think Boris Johnson is playing to real hard racists rather than to the more nuanced racism that has historically been embodied in the party.
Yeah, life is strange. We don't often praise barons and baronesses, but she did resign, or did she resign over Islamophobia, or was it because of the horror of recent Gaza massacre? I think she said that position was indefensible, so she was very forthright. But is she the exception that really highlights a pretty stringent rule otherwise?
I think she's the exception. I've heard her speaking about Islamophobia, and she's been excellent in her general analysis of Islamophobia, perhaps better than you would expect somebody from that kind of political background, even when they are themselves a Muslim. And she's also been, expressed deep concern about the position in the Tory party. But there's a more complicated history than that, perhaps, because at some points in post-war history, the Tory party has, in the course of its geopolitical manoeuvres, inclined a little bit more to Arab states in the Middle East than the Labour Party has at some times.
Is the basic problem, Richard, for our elite that a fairly high proportion of the British public, God help us, considered the British Empire to have been a sort of, of some benefit to the planet, not rape and massacre and extermination? Is it that so many Muslims from the Indian subcontinent and elsewhere have grandparents who know otherwise, who understood from another perspective the reality of the British Empire, and that they have been insufficiently socialized, and therefore they don't sing the patriotic song or the song of beneficent empire sufficiently well? Sajid Javid and others do, but maybe a lot of times leave something to be desired from the point of view of our rulers. Yeah,
I'm sure that's the correct case, and it's one of the reasons why we need more diversity in our society in order to help all of us join the rest of the world and take a decent perspective on things. Because across a lot of the world, across, for instance, India, which is now in the grip of a very right-wing government, but if you talk to people right across the political spectrum there, it's almost taken for granted that the British Empire in India was a bad thing that they were glad to be rid of. Whereas over in this country, even where there isn't a lot of analysis of it, we still see a recycling of Raj nostalgia. So there's we're living in a globalized world where a great deal of people's outlook on economic matters is unifying, and a great deal of that unification, I think, is not entirely a good thing. There's a neoliberal consensus taking shape, but there are fault lines in that, because people people in countries that have experienced colonialism are not willing to swallow the idea that colonialism was part of human progress. So, this is a dialogue we need to encourage, and it's why minorities in this country.
Is there a subtext then, Richard? I mean, go back a couple of years, you'll know much more about this than I do, but I get the impression a few years ago, at the same time as Prevent, or a little bit before Prevent, that there was a lot of money swishing around for any Muslims who would agree to join the mainstream, but not talk about Iraq or Palestine or Afghanistan. Did I get that right?
Yes, it's another complicated push and shove. The dates aren't quite in my mind, but there was a time when, particularly south of the border, the situation's always been a bit more mysterious in Scotland, which perhaps we can come back to. But south of the border, there was, as you say, quite a lot of money swishing around. Now, there was two problems with that. One is that, a lot of Muslim and in general minority NGOs were keen to find any sort of funding that they could, funding that would have come under a more progressive agenda, then got turned into social cohesion funding, which had problems of its own, but not as bad as the problems that then emerged under Prevent. But as these organizations started working with Prevent, as well as getting pushback from their own communities, there were pushback from the right, from Tories, who were saying the government's giving money to extremist organisations. So there's pressure from two directions at once, causing a bit of a rethink. This was under the Labour government, and one of the changes that came about when the Tories came to power under David Cameron was a rather tighter control of that funding, which probably made all this process less useful to the secret state. That's another of those paradoxes. But the situation goes on. The Scottish government has admitted to providing Prevent funding in a small number of cases, but the great bulk of the total funding, we don't know who it's allocated to in Scotland. It presumably goes to NGOs of some kind or another, but we don't actually know who they are, and that's damaging to the trust and transparency in public life.
Yeah, I used to teach at Edinburgh Napier University, and I remember going to a Prevent meeting where a rather shamefaced, I spoke to him afterwards, Muslim guy, gave a presentation. The cops were there, and they said it was really important to prevent people becoming radicals. I pointed out that I considered myself to be a radical, i.e. I wanted a substantial transformation of society. They didn't answer it, they just went quiet. They were trying to present the word radical, radicalise and radicalisation as inevitably meaning moving towards Al-Qaeda or something like that. What's your comments on the fight over the meaning of words that Prevent and others are promoting? How do we respond?
Well, the first thing is, you're absolutely right, and we should be fighting over the meaning of words, and much too often we other people on our side run away from that fight. So that, quite often I will hear people who are being strongly critical, not just to Prevent, but of the whole programme surrounding it, still seize on the word radicalisation, say, why isn't the government tackling some other kind of radicalisation, still talk about where were people radicalised. Well, just last week I went to a hustings in Edinburgh, representatives from several political parties there, including Tommy Shepherd from the SNP. The hustings was organised by the Radical Independence Campaign. So what was it doing? Was it radicalising the politicians who were on that panel? We need to seize on this word, and part of the problem confronting us, and particularly in the Middle East, is that politics there keeps getting translated into destructive forms, including terrorism. The path out of that is a radical path. There is no other path out of it. So we do need to be seizing back language. We need to be a lot more aggressive about that than I think we have been.
Well, let's bring this round to the Middle East then. Britain invades Iraq, slaughters or joins in as a junior in the slaughter of many tens of thousands of Iraqis, devastates the economy, has boots on the ground in Syria, helps to bomb and slaughter, I know it's not Middle East, but North Africa, Libya, and then we come to Palestine. And at the same time as Israel is accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity for the use of snipers, cutting down children, disabled journalists, and so on, Britain multiplies its arms sales to Israel by a factor of 10. Now, the great majority of Palestinians are Muslims, by no means all. The Christians seem to be being ignored by our local Christians. But doesn't Israel have to promote Islamophobia in order to justify a racist state selecting people for oppression or even death purely on the basis of their, things that can never be done to Israeli Jewish citizens can certainly be done to Muslims? Isn't Islamophobia inherent in the necessary defense of the state? I really appreciate your comments on that.
Yeah, I think Islamophobia is either inherent or present in the whole of that sequence of events, and the British government at the time of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars wanted on the one hand to declare that it wasn't Islamophobic, and on the other hand to portray part of the problem as being a wrong interpretation of Islam, rather than seeing the problem as being rooted in politics. And when we go to Israel and Palestine, you see versions of the same process. Even before the nation-state law in Israel, the country's been based around a whole series of structures and laws that probably you know in more detail than I do, whose effects are to make Palestinian citizens of Israel, or Israeli Arabs as Israel prefers to call them, into second-class citizens, and also to justify a military occupation in the West Bank and in effect an occupation in Gaza by oversights that has persisted for far longer than anything than an occupation ought to. All of that's only possible by saying there's something different about the people the other side of that wall. Sometimes it's focused around Arabness, sometimes it's focused around Islamness. It's all, the discourse is always designed to somehow creep around the edges of cultural norms that have come to reject racism, while at the same time evoking racism in people's minds. So, Israel wants to present itself as a bastion of democracy, order, some kind of functioning civil society, and it wants to present the other side of the apartheid wall as being inevitably chaotic and dysfunctional, and it wants to find something to attribute that dysfunctionalness to other than the regular bombings, assassinations, deprivation of infrastructure, water, and so on. Let's in fact make it so. So yes, just as very often as a human rights campaigner, I think that other organisations doing that in relation to what Britain's wars in the Middle East seem sometimes to be acting as if they think you can have a colonial war that doesn't breach human rights. Of course you can't. Of course, our government and the military are in some sense right to think that if you're going to conduct a colonial war and occupation, you're going to have to trample on human rights. And in the same way, to run a state constructed as a homeland for a specific ethno-religious group, the Jews, it's not, that is inevitably going to involve trampling on human rights, and it's inevitably going to involve, at the very minimum, references and dog whistles towards racism, and as we see under Netanyahu, something a lot more blatant than that.
Let's talk a little bit about this racism that we would agree on. Boris Johnson would have no problem with Mohammed bin Salman, who's an Arab, and maybe he's a Muslim, who knows. It's not a case of personal animus that we're talking about. We are talking about racism as built into a system. It can easily contain within it people who are affectionate towards their servants. Slave owners can be affectionate towards their slaves. But the racism we're talking about here cannot. Our government or the Israeli government tries to refute accusations of racism by saying, look, we have a high court judge who's an Arab. We have a diplomat who's a Druze or something like that. But some blacks in South Africa were actually relatively privileged under apartheid, were they not? There's always some element in the underclass, the undergroup, who can be co-opted into the overall system of oppression. Would you like to comment on that, Richard?
Yes, I think quite often we construct a myth of what racism was like in the past and then say the present isn't racist because it wasn't like that. But the British Empire, surely at least progressive people can agree, was an intrinsically racist structure, but it was built by, particularly in its earlier phase in the 18th century, built by people who, entrepreneurs who went from Britain, had very open-minded relations with the elite layers of the communities and the countries they came from, whether you're talking about Singapore or India. You entered into relationships with those people, business, military, political relationships, but always the underpinning it was the political and military power of Britain, and in a relationship to that were racist assumptions in the British population at home. So I think there are I'm sure there are counterexamples, but there are very few big, important, on a global scale, racist and imperialist structures where over centuries of history, you would fail to see people from the non-white community who were taking a leading role and part of that structure. It's nothing new. The shape of it keeps changing, but it's nothing new. We shouldn't be assessing the racism of a structure by measuring it against a fairy tale that we've invented in our head. We should measure it against actual historical experiences of these things.
Let's come to a topic that can generally be quite interesting, but is also an issue not just in Scotland, but across the UK. Over in the USA, we see Black Lives Matter. It's not a Muslim group. We see Black Lives Matter campaigning against the shooting of black people capriciously by cops and vigilantes. And they have adopted the challenge, the struggle of the Palestinian people as an integral part of their struggle. What's in your view, what's the relationship between a struggle against domestic racism, which threatens to engulf us? I mean, the idea of this horror show becoming the government again after Thursday is quite frightening. A lot of people are frightened. So we need to struggle against racism to the limit of our ability. But what's the relationship between that and the British government's racist policies abroad? The ethnic cleansing of the Chagos Islands, every single person kicked out, the support for Israel to massacre Palestinians, and so on and so on. Is it possible to draw a line between a struggle against racism domestically and an understanding and an integration of that struggle with imperial domination and racism on an even higher level internationally? Your comments, Richard, please.
Well, I think it should be not just possible, but completely obvious and straightforward and easy. And the history that's got us here is a shared history: the colonization of the Americas, the expulsion of Muslims from Spain, the transatlantic slave trade, the growth of the British Empire, the current forms of colonialism that still echo those things. So the connections are obvious. So the issue is not so much is it possible to draw those connections, but why does it seem to be difficult? And it seems to be difficult because there are efforts from government to make it so, and sometimes because I think we on our side as campaigners get it wrong, and there's a grave danger of attributing government manipulation to some issues that are real. So, for instance, I don't think there's much doubt that the British government would like to court, the successive British governments would like to court the black community as in order to establish its non-racism, in order to answer the charges that its overseas wars are racist. But black people have been overwhelmingly the victims of police shootings. There's a total failure of the justice system over that. The British government's response to the rioting that followed the shooting of Mark Duggan was to trivialise it and criminalise it. So I think it ill behoves us to say to black people who are perhaps slow to ally to some of these other struggles, what are you doing? You're being manipulated by government, when all of us on the left, progressive people, have failed to make any really serious inroad into anti-black racism. So I think we have to approach all these issues with a degree of humility and recognise that it isn't the case that all the problems are created by government, but government will sure as hell exploit quite consciously all divisions that there are. So there's a price to solidarity. Requires a price. It requires that you actually go and do some work before you can start making suggestions about what needs to be done. But going back to your starting point, it's absolutely fantastic that Black Lives Matter in the US have taken that position, and that needs to be built on. I don't think either of those struggles against Islamophobia or against anti-black racism will succeed unless they can join up. But we need to be serious about linking them and realise that there's a whole range of issues and a whole range of experiences that people have in their lives to bring to these issues.
And if we need to build a powerful movement to fight racism, that has to include all the militant anti-racists, those of us who, depending on the light, might look a little bit white or pink or whatever, and the people who are the direct victims of popular racism, black and brown people, and Irish people 70 years ago or even less. Eastern Europeans are the victims of racism. It doesn't seem to have much to do with pigmentation per se. But in order to build that movement, we would have to build it at a molecular level, at a street level, at a community level, workplace, towns and cities. And that surely has to mean that we deal with the concerns of individuals who have a very important perspective here in Britain, but they have a wider perspective than many other Brits because they go back to Jamaica or to Calcutta. Final remarks on that before I move on to the BBC, Richard, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think that's vitally important, and it's important to remember that we're working from perhaps a position of weakness in Scotland. Scotland's a very, I'm not sure I like the word white, but anyway, Scotland's a very white country. And our conference and the issues we began with are about Islamophobia. It's important to come back to the Muslim community in Scotland is a tiny community. It was just under 1.5% at the last census. It'll be a little bit more now and a little bit more in younger age groups, but it's tiny. But it's important. Of course, however tiny a community is, it's completely entitled to live free from discrimination and abuse. But that community is important for more reasons than that. It's because it stands in the crosshairs of this global process that's shaped the politics around us, both through those wars in the Middle East, through the way that that parties on the far right leveraged it to in campaigns about the EU, through the way that free movement within Europe, which is a little bit of a joke because Europe has a policy of no free movement for people outside Europe, but that free movement within Europe was targeted partly by making associations between it and movement of asylum seekers from outside Europe through Calais, partly by at an early stage, late 90s, early 2000s, of an association of people from Eastern Europe with racist tropes. You know, there's a history of racism directed against Slavic people, and that was a feature of Nazi Germany and of other racist structures since. So the definition of what constitutes another race is always fluid, always malleable, always adjusted to meet the needs of the moment. But my point really is that, you know, the issues we were talking about and our conference next Saturday, which is specifically focused around the effect that Islamophobia has on political space, civil society space, depends not on the numbers of Muslims who are directly experiencing it, but also depends on the way that discourse has shaped much, much larger political issues. So, you know, we need to put the people at the front line, the Muslims, at the center of that discourse. But we have to remember it's not just a discussion about ensuring the security in our society of a few thousand people. It's a discussion about preventing our politics being distorted on a much larger scale than that.
Okay. Richard, this monstrous creature may be an elected Prime Minister on Friday morning. God forbid, we'll pull out all the stops we can to support anti-racist who's finally in the running to be Prime Minister. Obviously, Jeremy Corbyn, I'm not in the Labour Party. I could be critical of Jeremy in many ways, but if it's between Jeremy Corbyn and political Ebola, then we need to be out as much as we can between now and Friday. I'll be driving people to the polling station. They're up in Scotland here, so as far as I'm concerned, it's either Labour or SNP. I'll drive any of those people to the polling station to keep the Tories out. But the BBC can't quite pretend that Corbyn's other than a, Johnson's other than a slug. So they seem to be then saying, well, most of the British people don't like either Corbyn or Johnson, equating the two. BBC balance in a new form. And it's the same with Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. They seem to be saying the Labour Party does anti-Semitism, the Tory Party does Islamophobia. So come on, even Stephen, let's talk about something else. Right. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, firstly, I'm sure you're absolutely right that a government led by Jeremy Corbyn, whatever exactly you think of some details of Labour policy, a government headed by Jeremy Corbyn is by far the best hope for this country at this point, and probably one of the most progressive moments that we've seen in British history for it to come about. But yes, there's a whole set of false equivalences and a whole set of political calculations around them. I think what we're going to see next week is, despite the assurances that Jeremy Corbyn isn't popular, all the signs are that the establishment in all its forms, including the BBC, are fearful that that might not, in fact, be the case. And if they feel they may not be able to persuade people flat out to oppose Jeremy Corbyn, they can just spread an idea, hey, we don't like politicians, we don't like either of these two people, we've got a bad choice. And that's an idea that has mileage to it. People are so used to being critical of people at the top of hierarchies, so used to seeing bad stuff coming from governments, that if you say a plague on both your houses, that's convincing to a lot of people. And if I hear an anarchist or a socialist revolutionary saying that, fine, no problem with that. It's rooted in their approach to politics. I understand that, but it's rather different when we see people in the mainstream commentariat, if you like, saying that. What they're actually trying to do is keep the voter turnout down, because in spite of all the bile directed at Jeremy Corbyn, they fear that a high turnout will will favour Labour, and so a great deal of that stuff is directed at simply keeping the turnout down. And as for this bipolar racism, problem is that over here on our left we have the Labour Party and they're anti-Semitic, and over here on the right we have the Tories and they're Islamophobic or racist in some other way. Well, does anybody really believe that the Tory party aren't anti-Semitic? Now, I think you have to belong to a community to hear the worst of what's directed at it, but sometimes it's actually, if you're not, that you hear the little jibes on the side. And going back a few years now, I would often hear little anti-Semitic jibes in Scottish or Edinburgh bourgeois circles. I frequent them even less now than I did then, so I don't hear them. But it was coming from people who, whose politics I don't exactly know, but I strongly suspect they would be actual Tory voters, and I strongly suspect the Tory parties like that. But in any case, we have to remember that when we're talking about racism directed at Muslims, we're talking about people being bundled on planes and deported by the government, people overseas being assassinated by drones by the government, people being denied basic human rights by the government, people being killed on the streets, as it happened once or twice by far-right thugs.
Or plucked off the street and sent to the West Indies, where some of them had never been, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. So, which is, I think, a slightly secondary point is we talk, I think, on the left much too often as if the danger from far-right groups like the SDL is the biggest danger. Now, certainly those groups are potentially extremely dangerous. History tells us how dangerous they can be. They need to be kept off the streets. But the discussion is often shaped around the idea that that's hardcore racism and it's violent, and other forms of racism, government racism, are somehow more nuanced, they're institutional rather than direct or violent. Now, if you're bundled onto a plane to a country you haven't seen by an overwhelming force that you can't possibly resist, I don't see how that can be considered to be anything other than a form of violence, and it's enacted on a scale that's way, way beyond the reach of any far-right group operating in this country. So, yes, we do have to look at all that and consider the discrimination and rather nuanced abuse directed against the Jewish community from some quarters in relation to that. But I would still say even that more nuanced abuse, I would be most surprised if it wasn't present, being whispered behind closed doors in the Tory party. And while I dislike quite a lot about the Labour Party, I would actually be surprised if it's whispered very much in the Labour Party. So the whole discussion has got hopelessly distorted by a political game. It would be great if that was just electoral gamesmanship and it would end on the day of the election, whatever the outcome of the election. But my fear is that it won't. It will strengthen trends that are anyway present in society and amongst politicians, and that's why it's so important that we call it out and deal with it now.
Richard, we've got time to deal with a couple of extra themes. One of them I would ask you for your thoughts on. The name of the conference in London is Islamophobia and the Closing Down of Public Spaces. More or less got that right. We've had public spaces closed down to us as a campaign. Edinburgh churches banned Jackie Walker from speaking, black Jewish comrade, allegedly an anti-Semite, disgraceful allegation, but the churches caved in and banned her. Perhaps more even than that, more more dramatic was Richard Falk, Professor Emeritus of International Law, the UN Rapporteur for Human Rights in Palestine, came to speak in Edinburgh and did indeed speak in Edinburgh, but I booked the City Chambers for Richard Falk to speak on Palestine, the search for a just peace. And the meeting was closed down because it was very controversial. Now, we see this replicated up and down the whole of the UK and well beyond. I think, what was the most recent government? French or some other government just recently said anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. What lessons might we be able to draw in a conference, but hint at it here, in terms of Islamophobia closing down public spaces from the stark reality of false allegations of anti-Semitism towards Palestine supporters closing down public spaces? So what's the idea about this closing down public spaces, Richard? Can you suggest what we'll be discussing? Because I'll be there on Saturday.
Yeah. Well, firstly, the theme Islamophobia and shrinking a civil society space is a theme of both conferences, the Glasgow and London conferences. And the kind of process you were talking about just then is exactly one of the things we have in mind. You know, the title is Islamophobia and the shrinking of civil society space. So the focus is on the relationship between those two things, and that shrinking down, that shrinkage instrumentalized through false allegations of anti-Semitism is intimately linked to Islamophobia, because it derives from Palestine, and the attempt to construct an apartheid state there to separate Jews from Muslims, intrinsically Islamophobic. Well, Jews from Muslims, Christians,
Muslims who fight against racism or who fight against imperial domination from a Muslim ethic are then accused of being anti-Semitic. Is that one of the points you're making?
Yes, but the point I'm making is wider than that. That of course, those issues are linked, and that's why we'll be discussing the use of allegations of anti-Semitism to shut down public space in general, not specifically necessarily where it targets Muslims. But a difficulty is because the existence of Islamophobia and a set of structures built on that makes Muslims easier targets for this. So Muslims are apt to be more, and particularly Muslim organizations are apt to be more concerned, more afraid, if you like, of allegations of anti-Semitism than people from outside that community. And there are a whole set of structures encouraged by government to try to pull them that way. Interfaith organizations and so are often shaped around a governmental agenda. In some cases, actually get government money, as quite a few years ago, Edinburgh Interfaith got Prevent money, for instance. We don't know more recently. So, there's a lot of reasons why Muslims are a particular target of a process, but the conference doesn't have to. I don't think the conference should confine itself to the impact of this on Muslims. What's happening is that our collective capacity as progressive people, a collection of left-inclined organizations, our collective capacity to act and campaign in solidarity with Palestine is being limited by false allegations of anti-Semitism, and that's a very big political effect, and we need to push back very vigorously against it.
So, this election's coming up on Thursday. We really have to imagine how we're going to feel on Friday morning. Not just not be alarmed. Well, be alarmed, but not be paralysed, and do everything we can for the next 4 or 5 days to get a vote out against the Tories. We don't want to whinge. A lot of people are hitting their keyboard and they're telling stories of horror, but we really want to move people to do something for the next 4 days, Richard, do we not? How can we do that? Any ideas?
Well, I think You need to begin by imagining that you wake up on Friday morning with a Boris Johnson government, and you need to reflect that that the Tories, Boris Johnson, his colleagues in cabinet, have been given one hell of a scare. You know, people keep dismissing Labour and keep finding that it can fight back very effectively. So we're not just, if the Tories have returned to power with something like a majority, I don't think we're just going to be confronting a continuation of the nightmare which people on benefits, people needing hospital treatment, minority communities have all been seeing. I think we're going to see that government doing all it can to make sure it doesn't get a repeat of the fright we've given it. So we really need to win this. I would add to that, I always hate people making rather melodramatic last battle speeches in politics. Politics goes on, life goes on. If we do confront that situation, we have to organise and fight back. But that's tomorrow's question, and possibly a question we'll return to at the conference. Far and away the best thing is that we get this bunch of leeches off our backs. And if you doubt the need for that, just run in your mind what you think is likely to happen in the first week of a return to power by Boris Johnson.
Richard, where are we on Saturday? And we kick off at 11 o'clock, I think.
We kick off at 11 o'clock, and that means really kick off. We'll start having discussions at 11 o'clock. So I'd really urge people to.
Can people not just slouch in half an hour late? Can we not just keep to that old rotten tradition of wandering in at 1:15, 1/2
I'm sure people will do that, and they'll be made welcome, and we'll incorporate them. But since people will be doing that,
don't do it. Turn up on time. Yeah,
we'll be much better placed to handle the people who do that if as many people as possible come along at 10:30, get registered, get copies of their programs, and understand what's going on at the event. But
will we get tea and biscuits and coffee at 10:30?
We'll get tea and biscuits and coffee. And to anybody who can't make it for all day, we'd love to see you. If you have a look at the programme on our website, you can just go to www.sacc.org.uk and you'll find a link to the website. You can go and see the programme, see what interests you, or just come along when work or other commitments allow it. We'd love you to come all day, but we'd also like to see you if you can only spare an hour.
Richard Haley from Scotland Against Criminalising Communities. You've been putting up a great fight for many years. Thanks very much for agreeing to be interviewed. And this interview will be available on Facebook a very few minutes after we wind up. I'll be there on Saturday. I'm privileged to be one of the speakers in one of the plenums. And I would look forward to some of the viewers from here coming to Glasgow City Centre on Saturday morning to join in what will be a very timely conversation. It'll go a bit deeper than most superficial discussions. But still, first they came for the Muslims and I didn't do anything. And then when they came for me, there was nobody to defend me. That will be one of the, I think that should be the ethos of our response to Islamophobia, or the victimization of any racial or sort of racial minority, or any group that's picked out for stigmatization and particular levels of oppression. So, friends, thanks for listening. Thanks again to Richard, and thanks for listening in. Please like the page, share the recording of this conversation. It really helps us to get the message over, but above all, fight. If this monstrous blob becomes the Prime Minister on Friday morning by election, Richard's right. Don't prod a crocodile and then just turn your back on it. It'll bite you. And these people have been frightened by the idea of someone who wants to close off the NHS to American corporations, wants to clear homeless people off the streets, not in the way Tory councils do it, by criminalising them, but by making housing available and ending this shame for all of us. So don't frighten them and think that they'll go back to normal. Richard's absolutely right on that one. Get on your social media, pick up the phone, make sure your granny or your auntie or people low-hanging fruit, people you know, make sure that they vote on Thursday, and if they need a lift, offer them a lift. Get in touch with the Labour Party or the Greens or Plaid Cymru, or up here the SNP if you're so inclined. I am, to say we'll take your voters to the polls on Thursday at any time from early till late. Much to fight for, but I look forward to seeing you again on Saturday. Thanks again, Richard. It's really a pleasure having you. Take care.
And thanks very much, Mike. Pleasure talking to you.
Bye, everybody.